Thank you so much, Anna, and thank you all of you for coming today and joining me here today, joining all of us here today to explore questions that are pressing for our times. It's really such an honor to be here at Puistokatu. It's a wonderful space. I've had a tour this morning, and I very rarely wear skirts, like almost never, but exactly today I wore a skirt to a place where people don't normally wear shoes, but I didn't wear the right socks for that. So so I'm going to stand out, and I'm keeping my shoes on. So we're going to be discussing what type of knowledge we need in the world today, and I've got quite a lot to cover. So we're going to, just to give you a sense of the talk, I'm going to look back in history to how we came to harboring the kind of knowledge that that dominates the world today, so the conventional and dominant type of knowledge. And then I will talk a bit about the alternative ways of knowing that I believe that our world desperately needs. But I first want to start with my story and sharing how I came to be interested in this kind of topics. So I grew up in Lagos in Nigeria. I have a Finnish mother and a Nigerian father. I was born here in Finland, but I returned to Nigeria when I was just a few months old. And I grew up in an environment with a lot of stories. So surrounding me were all kinds of enchanting and mysterious worlds, and I was really fascinated with my environment. So there were, first of all, stories that came to me because of my own background, being interethnic of Finnish and Nigerian heritage. Also, my Nigerian side is part of the Yoruba ethnic group, which is one of the world's largest ethnic groups, actually. So it's really not a tribe. Sometimes we're referred to as a tribe, but there's actually like tens of millions of Yoruba people around the world. So I was also Yoruba, and my father is a Muslim, my mother a Protestant, although not practicing. And then I lived in a family compound of sorts, so we had our own flat, but we lived in this big compound, and there were also my aunties and uncles, and intermittently my grandmother lived with us. And these were people who all also had different faiths. We had many workers in the house as well, or in the compound, and they came from different parts of the country, different ethnicities. So there were all these stories also about faith and language and background. And then there were the stories just of the country, the city itself, and then the country and the continent that I was growing up in. So it was, for one, a patriarchal society, which was something that I perceived from a very young age already. I had a strong sense awareness of living in a society where women and men were treated differently. In fact, my very earliest memory in life is a feminist memory. I was probably about 4 years old, and I can't remember exactly what it was that had happened. But there was something that us girls were told that we couldn't do, that boys were allowed to do, and I remember feeling really, really angry. And this was kind of a common feature of my childhood in Lagos, that, you know, girls do certain things, boys do other things. And this is quite common around the world, but it had its own, you know, specific features in Nigeria. And then it was also a colonial or a neo-colonial society, and it was quite palpable that it was so. I felt you could feel it in education, for instance. My school had very much of still that British influence. It was apparent in politics, in language, of course. You know, the language that we spoke, the lingua franca in Nigeria is English. So there were all these stories also about a society that was in between worlds, you could say, and that really intrigued me and disturbed me. I also had, my parents were progressive people, so our house was filled with books, but also we would have people come to our house very often. We had friends, family, and everybody talked about politics and democracy and, what is the future of nice. So all these conversations, all these stories that were there around me. And basically, what this did was make me very interested in the question of power. The question of power was really central to me from early on. Because I observed so many power dynamics, so many inequalities between women and men, between being of Finnish heritage. We would come to Finland very often, and I could see that there was such a difference between these two societies, these two heritages that I had. And I was bothered by that inequality of power. And all my life, I continued to be in the grip of this curiosity of mine. Like, what is it? What is power? Why do some people have it? Why don't other people have access to this power? And later in my life, when I moved to Sweden, where I lived for about a decade, and where I studied, I wrote my thesis about power. Power was my obsession, up until the point that I was to write my first book. And I wrote a book about knowledge and not power. And this was quite strange to me because, one, as a feminist, like all feminists are concerned with the question of power. Like, that really is the central thing. And then for me, it had been this very specific phenomenon. And yet, the book, Sensuous Knowledge, Aistien viisaus in Finnish, it sort of really was a book that came to me. It landed in my lap almost and said, you are going to write me. So it wasn't a deliberative process of, maybe I should write about knowledge. Excuse me. It just was so. And it was kind of strange to me that would be the case. But the reason for this turn from power to knowledge as a kind of preoccupation had to do with observation that I had made about how power works, and this is the observation. So when we think about the power structure that we have in society, we can think of it as this kind of chain of being, a pyramid, which many of us will have thought about in one way or the other. So if we think of power structures as a pyramid, and let's call this pyramid Pyramid 1, then we see that at the top of this pyramid we have white men, and then we have men of color and white women maybe on the next layer, and then we have women of color on the third layer, and in each of these tiers there are sub-layers. So in this layer where we find women of color, we would also see that there are different hierarchies there. So lighter-skinned women might have more power over darker-skinned women, and colorism and all of that would impact the power dynamic. And then on the next tier, we have other animals. And then at the very bottom, we would find what we call nature, as though we were not a part of that, and plants and fungi and so on. And we are very many. I would feel quite confident to say everybody in this room is somebody who at some point has not only thought about this kind of existing structure, hierarchical structure, but who also resists it, who sees it as a problem. And I certainly have. I've been resisting this structure for most of my adult life. And yet, as I have taken part in many initiatives, I've traveled around the world to different platforms, organizations, institutions, and we're all really trying to grapple with this this issue of this pyramid, like how do we dismantle it? And why is it so stubborn? Why does it persist? And it seemed to me, or it occurred to me at one point, that we keep repeating that even those of us who are trying to resist and dismantle the pyramid are struggling to do so because the knowledge that we are using is somehow part of the problem. It is informing the same structure. And so I kind of came to see that there's another corresponding pyramid. So if pyramid 1 is the pyramid of power, there is also a pyramid of knowledge. Let's call this pyramid 2. And the pyramid of knowledge looks like this. So at the very top, there is reason and rationality. Then on the next layer, we would have something like emotional intelligence, then intuition, then instinct, and then at the very base, there's a kind of just like a vegetative ability to know how to exist. And I realized that the tiers in pyramid 1 tally with the tiers in pyramid 2. So white men are associated with reason and rationality, people of color with emotions and intuitions, animals, the natural world with instinct, and then plants, fungi at the bottom layer of pyramid 1 corresponded with this kind of idle knowing in pyramid 2. And if we don't change the structure of pyramid 2, we cannot change the structure of pyramid 1 because it keeps on justifying it in a kind of loop. And this is the motivation behind it was the motivation behind sensuous knowledge. Because I noticed that even though so many of us are grappling with dismantling pyramid 1, not enough of us are making this connection to the knowledge hierarchy that also exists. And so I've become really kind of obsessed with pyramid 2, with the pyramid of knowledge, in trying to understand it and trying to dissect it. And this is what I called, for those of you who have read my book, I call it Euro-patriarchal knowledge, right? So that's pyramid 2, basically. And so for the past, I mean, even before I wrote the book, I had already, of course, been trying to understand the structure, but I've continued to work on this and to really get to the bottom of, like, how did we get here? Why do we think of knowledge this way? Why do we make these associations? And the reason for my obsession with Euro-patriarchal knowledge is because I think that in order to fight against something, we need to understand it. So in some sense, to shine a light on something, to really understand it at its depth, is in its own way a kind of breaking it apart. Because when you see the deceptions and the delusions of a system, then you find it more difficult to believe in it anymore. So let's deconstruct Euro-patriarchal knowledge a little bit more, because I would like you all to leave today having a sense of like how we got here. And I think it's useful to pinpoint a moment when Euro-patriarchal knowledge, or pyramid 2, or the pyramid of knowledge, you know, we can call it these different things, when it actually started. And the symbolical moment that I'm going to pick for this is 1492, which of course is the year when Christopher Columbus, the Genoese explorer, arrived in what became Hispaniola. And when Columbus and his crew arrived in Hispaniola, they encountered a group of people who are called the Arawak, or were called the Arawak. There was over 1 million Arawak people. This was in 1492, and then by 1550, already there were only 500 Arawak people left. And I share this because we need to ask why, what was it that made Europe able to allow such a genocide to happen? How was this justified? And by the way, I tend to talk about Europe rather than Europeans, because I'm talking about a kind of Europe as almost like a metaphysical entity, so as a narrative, because we're talking here about knowledge. Because this is these are humans, right? Like there's some kind of drive. What is the incentive? Why was this allowed to happen? And there's all kinds of stories that, of course, are told about this. But one story that we rarely hear about, that I believe is a huge motivation for Europe in the late 15th century, is that Europe was poor. Europe was destitutingly, devastatingly poor. So with the exception of Genoa, where Christopher Columbus came from, and Venice, and maybe a few others here and there, but these were city-states that had a lot of wealth. And they had a lot of wealth because already then there had this kind of extraction from other parts of the world had already started. So in 1471, I think it is, so just about 20 years before Columbus comes to the Americas, Henry the Navigator of Portugal had set up a few ports along the coast of West Africa, one of which is Elmina, which is still in Ghana today. And they had started to excavate a whole lot of gold into Genoa and into Venice. Because prior to that, the kind of it wasn't exploitation per se, the trade of like gold and slaves even from Africa to Europe had happened through Arabs through middlemen via something called the caravan trade. So in 1471, there were now these ports from which resources could be extracted. And so what was going on? And so aside of these city-states, Europe was a place in which there was poverty, there was famine, there was the Little Ice Age in the beginning of the 16th century where crops just would not grow. And this led to wars and like a kind of feudalistic anarchy, really. There were, of course, the witch hunts and crusades. So we're trying to picture a society where people really could not survive. The conditions were just so severe, and it created this bloodthirsty, brutish mindset. And none of this is, of course, to justify what Europe then did. So necessity is not the same as justification. By contrast, I think when we frame it this way, when we understand this history, we can see, once again, there's a kind of deception going on here, because we mostly have received an education that the Europe that went out to discover the New World was like this level-headed, sophisticated place, right? When actually the very opposite was true, and whatever sophistication it came to hold was precisely because it was extracting resources from other parts of the world. And these resources were not only natural resources, but also ideas and knowledge. And so we also see this kind of reversal. With this framing, we can see a very, actually, disturbing, sad, problematic reversal, whereby this part of the world, where there was such scarcity, kind of turned it around so that the abundance came into Europe, and the other parts of the world that used to be abundant became plagued by that same kind of sense of necessity that Europe had had. So, back to, sorry, I get so carried away with this, I forgot my point. But yes, no, so the justification of this, of Europatriarchal knowledge, of Pyramid 2. Because, you know, if Europe was committing genocides, extraction, theft, out of a sense of necessity, it also needed to justify, if only for itself, why it was doing so. And so this is why, going back to the 1492 moment as a symbolical one, there needed to be some kind of story, some kind of like vehicle, a hermeneutic image that could just instantly communicate that this is okay to do. And I contend that there is a concept that helps Europe to do that. And this concept is the human. So the idea of the human. I don't mean Homo sapiens, as you know, as we are in our flesh and our bones, because what I'm going to say is that the human was invented in 1492. Again, I'm being quite symbolical here, but I think we can say this also actually analytically and relatively empirically. So before then, there isn't really a sense of humanity in the discourse, other than via religion. You know, there's some sense in Christendom and in Islam already that, you know, you don't do certain things because of your humanity, or, you know, you treat your neighbor as you treat yourself. But there isn't a concept of the human, you know, in the sense of human rights and the kinds of discourses that we have today. And so this concept needed to be invented, or rather it needed to be borrowed, because there were parameters for it that existed in the work of Aristotle, who had lived in the 4th century BCE, so long before this age of discovery. And Aristotle had, you know, in his Lyceum in ancient Greece, he was obsessed with categories and classification. So he had made these distinctions between the species. And of course, he also is the person to whom we owe the beginnings of deductive reasoning and the kind of metaphysical thought. Aristotle was, his kind of preoccupation, or at least one of them, was what he called eudaimonia. I don't know if you've heard eudaimonia. It's a Greek word for, it means flourishing. And Aristotle believed that the purpose of life was to achieve eudaimonia, so to achieve flourishing. And even in that sense, you know, we're still also Aristotelian, I can never say this, Aristotelian, whatever. Because, you know, we don't call it flourishing necessarily, although sometimes we do, but we mainly call it happiness. And we still are in this mindset of like the purpose of existence is to kind of achieve happiness. But he called it eudaimonia. And he believed that in order to achieve eudaimonia, that the way to eudaimonia was reasoning and rationalization. And so this was one of his incentives for creating these categorizations, because he wanted to get to eudaimonia. And he said, you know, plants and animals cannot reason and rationalize, so they can't achieve eudaimonia. And he also said that certain people, they were not called humans, remember, but like slaves were not able to reason and rationalize. And women, he said, in the sphere of the active or something like that, he called it cannot reason. He basically meant in politics, which is why there are some feminist scholars like Martha Nussbaum and Cynthia Freeman, some very notable feminist philosophers who kind of defend Aristotle and say that he wasn't saying that women cannot reason, he meant only within the political sphere. But I find that to be kind of cherry picking because, you know, come on, like if we cannot reason in politics, yeah, your laughter suggests that you see my point. And so Aristotle was the person to borrow from in this, you know, many centuries later. And I want to say that, you know, I'm of course being reductive here. Aristotle's contribution to knowledge is very impressive. He's probably shaped modern society more than any one single individual, for better or for worse. And also he himself would never have imagined what kind of impact his ideas would have. I mean, he lived in a tiny little society. You know, he wouldn't have thought that, oh, someday my work will be found from an old moldy cellar, which was literally the case, you know, hundreds of years later, and applied in the ways that it continues to be applied today. And so it was people like Thomas Aquinas, the Christian theologian, and Ibn Rushd, the Islamic scholar, who during this new age of discovery, or somewhat earlier, found Aristotle's old notes and started to integrate them into Christianity and Islam, quite controversially at the time, by saying that reason and rationality were gifts from God, and so therefore should become part of the religious canon. And that was not how people thought at the time. I want to keep an eye on the time. Okay, so these are sort of the historical roots of Europatriarchal knowledge, the foundational methodologies. But I want to think about the contemporary methodology of Europatriarchal knowledge, because these ideas, from the Aristotelian to Columbus in that age, were then of course continued by people like Descartes, famously equating cognition with the human. And importantly, what I want to emphasize is that what is happening here is that the human, the value of the human is being attributed to rationality, or maybe I should say that the other way around, like rationality and reason are being, there's a narrative here that is emerging, that this is what makes us, or this is what gives us value as humans, and if we don't have this, then we don't have value. So if you are just like this blob of DNA that is emotional or intuitive, like that is not value. What gives you value is your reason and your rationality. And the way, you know, we see this being upheld today with everything, like it's on steroids right now. You know, even if we look at artificial intelligence, like, you know, all of these LLMs, large learning models, are, at the moment there's a huge sort of crisis with LLMs, because basically they are becoming smarter than us. I mean, people often talk about can they become conscious, which, you know, that's a debate for another day. I don't think so, because consciousness is something different to intelligence or to smartness. But we are basically, sorry to share, but we are not smart enough. We are not rational enough for the LLMs. So now they're not able to grow as speedily as we do want them to grow in terms of the usage, because there's just not enough resource of reason and rationality, which is what they're being built on. So we're this idea that reason and rationality, equating it with consciousness, basically. That's why this conversation about AI is so convoluted, because, of course, if people think that our very consciousness, our very humanity is reason and rationality, then that is, it's easy then to see that AI are conscious, even though they may not have many other ways of knowing, which I'll talk about shortly. So anyway, the kind of vehicle that now in our contemporary society continues to escort or to transport this idea of Europatriarchal knowledge into society is dualistic thinking, which could be described in so many ways, but the dualism is the kind of master idea of Europatriarchal knowledge. And the dualism is a concept that is often used interchangeably with two other concepts, which are dichotomies and binaries. But there is a difference between these three, and I'm going to unpack them a little bit so that we understand. So a dichotomy is when there's a clear contrast between two things. So let's use the examples of day and night. That is a dichotomy. There is, it's a fact. There's what we call day, there's what we call night. We might say that it is light during the day and it is dark at night, although today is light, but I've been in Helsinki for 3 days and it's been dark during the day. And also when I'm in Finland during summer, it's of course light at night. So, already with a dichotomy, there's all kinds of nuances. But by large, a dichotomy is not, there's nothing inherently problematic about it. It's just saying that there are opposites. A binary is where it starts to get problematic. So with a binary, there is a value judgment is imposed upon a dichotomy. So it would be a binary to say, you say, yes, there's day and night, and day is bad and night is good. So you're imposing this value judgment. And the thing about binaries, because we get really hung up on binaries, but the thing about them is that they actually in some way do much more harm to the person or the group of persons who think in binary ways, because they're just limiting their own worlds. And there's no greater gift to being alive than the possibility of expanding your world and seeing the world larger than it's being handed to you. So the binarist is someone who's just narrowing it for themselves in some sense more than for others. The real bad guy is the dualist or the dualism, because the dualism is when there's not only a value judgment, but also a power dynamic is imposed upon the dichotomy and the binary. So this is taking us back to the pyramid, because the dualism would say, if we stay with this example, that there is day and night. Day is bad, that's the binary, and night is good. And then the dualism would say, or the dualism would invest power into institutions, into education, into politics, into narratives, in order to say that day is so bad that we are banning. You cannot go out during the day, okay? And we're going to create movies and books about how bad day is and how good night is, or vice versa, whatever, right? So this is how the dualism functions. And this is, by the way, from a feminist perspective, because in the feminist tradition, we're always looking at power. In philosophy, when people talk about dualisms, they're less concerned with power and more concerned with just how two things constitute a whole. So actually, how am I doing for time? Good. Yeah, but when did we start again? Okay, great. Perfect. Yes. So, moving to, like, how do we move away from Europatriarchal knowledge? How do we dismantle the damn pyramid and live in a world where there's no hierarchies? Because that's what we all want, right? Like, we want to just live in a more beautiful, expansive, non-binarist, non-dualist world. And it's not even about, or just about, what we want. It's also about what we actually need now. Like, our planet, our societies can just no longer function through Europatriarchal knowledge. Like, it has never helped us, but it really is not helping us now. And, you know, I think that this is, because this is about hope as well, you know, this is the theme of your events here. And I think hope is also, it's a really important quality, although hope unchallenged becomes a kind of illusion. So we need to be mindful of that. We need to always put hope into context. But I think that right now, in our 21st century post-pandemic era, something is shifting in a big way. I think we all feel that, you know, even if it's a kind of dystopian feeling in some ways, you know, we're all a bit confused about the world, and it's quite frightening, like what is happening with politics and polarization and climate change and genocides, and, like, you know, there's so much to worry about. But something is shifting. And I think that this has to do, actually, with people are beginning to awaken to pyramids, especially Pyramid 1, but also to an extent to Pyramid 2. And I think this shift really was catalyzed or concentrated by the pandemic and by the lockdown, because you know, when we were all, like, locked away in quarantine, literally, well, I think also in Finland there was a quarantine, right? In Sweden there wasn't. We couldn't do anything else but, like, observe. And one of the things that we observed was how the rest of nature was starting to thrive. I mean, thrive is maybe a big word, but you know, but it was. There were dolphins in Venice, and more birds singing, and, you know, pollution was reduced. And I think that whether we articulated it or not, like, that kind of phenomenon brings the existential question forth of, like, what kind of species are we if it takes us being locked away, literally locked away, for the rest of nature to have a chance of surviving. And then from that opens a whole new Pandora's box of questions. You know, like, also we watched how essential workers, as we came to call them, I'm sure this happened also here, where, you know, they just, yeah, it showed us how dependent we are on groups of people that we may not otherwise really think about. And furthermore, in the UK, in London, where I live, or in England, essential workers, when they contracted COVID-19, they still had to go to work. They weren't given equal, you know, good pay. Then there was, of course, increases in domestic violence against women by men. Twice as many Black people and Asian people died from COVID than white people, again, in the UK. I don't know what it was like here. And then, of course, when the vaccine came out, you know, with Moderna, Pfizer, all these companies, they patented them so that poor countries or impoverished countries could not give their people the vaccine. And so there was this, like, vaccine apart. So there's all this stuff going on, is basically what I'm getting at, where we're noticing that in this moment of deep crisis, there's just so many inequalities that seem to not make sense. And then in the middle of all this, in May 2020, George Floyd was brutally murdered. And that moment, again, I think is a really symbolical one for the shift that we're still feeling, because we had already started to open our eyes to all of these inequalities, and then it was there. People could go on their phone and watch this man be brutally killed. So it was like the final evidence that actually human value is not equal, even though we are supposed to think that it is. And so I think that the protests that happened following George Floyd's murder were protests, of course, against racial injustice, but I think they were also protests against a knowledge system that has, against Europatriarchal knowledge, against Pyramid One, saying we don't want the world to look like this anymore, because these protests spread to everywhere. And I think even today with the protests against the genocide in Gaza, we're seeing the same, it's that there's a spirit there that contains this shift. So there's hope coming from the worst kind of scenarios, but this is why I think it's so important that right now, when there is this very tiny opening, because we have to remember we are a bubble. So many people in the world are not even having these types of conversations, but there is this glitch into which we can try to rethink how we attribute human value, humanity to others, other people, the natural elements, and so on. And so some of the other elements of knowledge, other elements of existence that are just as intrinsic and central to our story are what I refer to as sensuous knowledge, and why I think we need sensuous knowledge in the 21st century. Sensuous knowledge is looking at the kind of, it's moving away from this need to control, create hierarchy, to stay in the world of dualism. So it's a non-dualistic way of looking at the world, and one in which other ways of knowing have central of a position as reason and rationality. People sometimes, when I talk about reason and rationality, people think that I'm against rational thinking. And I'm gonna have a confession to make. I've not shared this publicly before, but I recently heard a saying. I can't remember from which country now, but there's a saying that if you show me what a person is obsessed with, and I'll tell you what they don't have, or something. It's something similar, like show me your friends, and I can tell you who you are. And it really hit me, right? It pierced through me, because part of my obsession with, or my way I'm talking about sensuous knowledge, is because I'm actually, my inclination is to think very logically and rationally. And it sounds weird to say that about oneself, but this is feedback that I often get from people. It's like, oh, stop being so rationalist. So I actually really value rationality. It's really important to me, but maybe that's why I get so frustrated because to me it is irrational to think that rationality is all we have. Are you blind? Are you crazy? Come on, there's meditation is an example of another way of knowing. Meditation, and not everybody practices meditation in sitting, but we all contemplate. We all have moments that are meditative, and meditation is widely accepted as a form of knowledge, about the self, both the individual self and the collective self. Probably the best way to, if we want to learn about, the collective self, the deeper, innermost core of ourselves, meditation is probably the best type of knowledge. And And rationality is actually counterproductive to meditation. The whole point of meditation or contemplation, whatever you call it, is to stop trying to solve a puzzle, to stop logical analysis. And then there's dreaming, something we all do, some more than others. During the pandemic, I actually started to have like this recurring nightmare, or nightmares that had to do with the environment. So like in one dream, I was lying on the beach during summer, and all of a sudden a hailstorm started. And what was so airy about the dream was that nobody reacted. Like people just kept reading their books, and children were like playing around, and it was very jarring. And I had a series of dreams in this kind of nature. So I went online and I'm like, climate dreams. I just accidentally put that into Google. And then I came upon a website with that very title, Climate Dreams, which was made by a psychologist, I think they were, who had seen such an increase in people having these kind of dreams, so they started to collect them. And like loads of people around the world are having climate dreams. Now, this is not something, I'm not saying that this is not the kind of knowledge that we associate with knowledge, but it is not something we can dismiss when there's clearly something happening in the human unconscious. It is teaching us something, and we ought to pay attention to that. And then there's poetry, which, as the Black feminist writer Audre Lorde, I paraphrase, but she, and then there's wonderful TikTok videos that go on all of them. No, sorry. Poetry, Audre Lorde says, is a way of giving language to the nameless. And I dare any one of you to read a poem one that you like, and not feel that in some way, not feel like time stops somehow, right? When we read a poem that we like. And that's also a deep way of knowing. It's a similar thing that happens when you see a sublime natural scene, and you're just walking, going about your day, and then you see the scene and you stop. Like quite often you just have to stop and look, and we, in our modernized Euro-patriarchal way of thinking, we just think, this is something kind of external from me, and I need to take a picture, post it on Instagram, and it's fine, I do that as well, but actually that's a moment of knowledge. That's, we're being taught something if we can only just slow down and hear that. So I guess I want to make sure that there wasn't anything else before I share my concluding thought that I wanted to say. Maybe I'll share the image of the kaleidoscope, because I like images. And the kaleidoscope, I think, is the best kind of image, maybe not the best, but it's one way to think about sensuous knowledge. I look at it as it's a way of knowing that is kaleidoscopic, because as I describe in the book, it's about the with and within, rather than the either or even the both and. So the kaleidoscope is, when you pick one up, and it's amazing, whatever you point it at, and you all know a kaleidoscope, but what is it called in Finnish? Mä en olisi tiennyt, että se on kaleidoskooppi, niin sama, okei. Okay. Vähän harmi, kun mä luulen, että suomalaiset olisi pystynyt keksiin oikein jonkun semmoisen kunnon suomalaisen sanan kaleidoskoopille. Ehkä voimme koittaa miettiä, mikä se olisi. All right. So the kaleidoscope, you point it, whatever you're looking at starts to take on a new shape. So it has, you see more perspectives to that one thing, even if it's just a blue wall. You start to see different shades of blue. And so it's very enchanting. It's, it shows us that there's more to what we perceive, more than to what meets the eye. But the kaleidoscope is also, in some sense, we can also strip it down to its very materiality. It's a tube. The most basic kaleidoscope is just you just get a tube. You need some glue. You need some broken glass and some color. So it's actually there's a scientific way of describing it as well. And so it's really speaking to this kind of synthesizing element of sensuous knowledge, where what I'm trying to describe is this like holistic view of knowledge that contains both the beauty and the awe and the enchantment and the possibilities, by the way, which also can be negative. You can also think of the kaleidoscope as a symbol for populism or people who take a negative narrative but make it all shiny and glittery and colorful. But also that is, part of this pool of knowledge, and then also the scientific. And so this is the thing. This is the sensibility that I believe we have an opportunity to now really start to infuse knowledge with, politics with, ideas with, activism with, because otherwise, if we don't change the structure of Pyramid 2, we're going to continue to support the structure of Pyramid 1. And, in closing, I just want to say that it's not necessarily the detached, composed, kind of linear approach to eudaimonia that works. In fact, it's probably not really the best way to achieve eudaimonia, and maybe we need more of that orgiastic, Dionysian, colorful approach, and that is actually where we may find eudaimonia as individuals and as a community. Thank you.